Ulric, Kaelin's son, Jarl of Munenvox, a sim here in the Tormarkfell region. I welcome you to tonight's class. This is a standard weekly class. We have a class about Norse culture. Tonight I am standing in as a special substitute teacher, and we will be discussing a comparison of Norse culture to modern Earth culture, as well as, I will no doubt throw in a bit about gore. You will not receive any note cards on this topic. This is not put up on a web page. This doesn't exist anywhere, so enjoy it now. It is an ephemeral experience. That being said, let's get to the disclaimer. The information provided here is not intended to make claim that those of Tovaldsland or Norsemen or Vikings, or to make any statement about Tormarkfell being more Earth-like than Green, but instead to present an insight into what Torvi's ancestors were like. For though 1,000 years have passed since Torvald was brought from Earth, he was a Norseman, and this would have been what his culture was like. It is up to each to decide how much of this culture still persists in Tovaldsland. Right, thank you. Okay, now, I'm going to be covering a couple of bases in this discussion tonight, and it's not probably going to be quite as wild a ride as my normal weekly talk, rant, stroke, or whatever that is I do every week. We're going to be covering 4 major areas, or at least we're going to try to cover them this evening. Everyday life, life after death, myths, and world perception. And again, this is going to be a comparison between Nordic culture and modern day culture after Christianization, and of course there may be some commentary about gore. I'm going to start off with discussing men in the place of men. Now, many people think that almost all of the men in Nordic culture sailed in ships as Vikings to plunder and kill. This was not at all true. Most were peaceful and struggling farmers and craftsmen. We simply remember the sailors because, well, they were the biggest adventurers. They traveled the furthest, they had the most written about them, and they had the most impact on other cultures, which kept records as well. But your average Norseman was primarily a struggling farmer and craftsman. Just like those that were Vikings, just like the travelers, the farmer's life changed with the seasons. The Vikings left with their ships in the beginning of spring at the same time that the farmers began the work for the year. Now, one thing that made life a bit easier for all men and women was the climate at this time, because it was a couple of degrees milder than today. This made the winters shorter, and as a result, better crops. The ships were not stopped by ice as early as they would have been nowadays. You must remember that we're talking about a period of time after what was known as the Mini Ice Age. The warrior life, what we would call the Vikings, the Viking life, if you will, was, well, for obvious damn reasons, more dangerous than the farmers, but maybe a bit richer. They both had to rely on their own skills to survive, and the Viking warrior could not afford to make a mistake, but neither could the farmer. All right? Let me try to explain that and talk about that a little bit. What we think of as Viking was not a people. All right? Vikings were, it was a trade, if you will, a way of life, a role. But the Nordic people did not live or die by the actions of the Vikings, the raiders. They lived and died by the actions of the farmers and the craftspeople. Now, I'm sure if you've been to any of the other Nordic classes, this is already, old hat news for you. But I'm going to cover it here, and I'm covering it because we're about to go on to the place of women, where we're going to talk about some of those comparisons. Now, women of the Viking era were incredibly independent and strong-minded. Unlike a lot of other women in the world at that time, the Scandinavian women had almost as many rights as their men did. She was on her own. She was able to choose her own husband, and if later she wished, she could divorce him. There is some debate historically about the idea that what we think of as divorce was in fact first exemplified, first came into being amongst the Nordic cultures. Now that's a hot point of contention, and some historians will say yes and some will say no. I am bringing it up merely for you to reflect upon and to consider that as an idea. These women had the right to choose their own husbands, and later they could divorce said husbands. The strength of Scandinavian women was widely known, and there is, for example, tales from Iceland describing how the women care for the house and home when their men were away at sea. Now, this was a huge responsibility and may sometimes have made the women seem, well, hard, mean, grumpy, cast iron bitch. But you will see this if you read between the lines of many of the Icelandic stories, and I encourage you to look at those. Another way in which Scandinavian women showed their dignity and essential position both in society and at home was by wearing the house key in a rope around their waist. This symbolized their control over house and home. Let me say right there, does anybody immediately see a comparison to Gore? All right, we have that taken almost in whole cloth into Gore with the keeping of the keys. If you compare women during the Viking era to the Christian European women and today's modern women in Scandinavia, you will see a clear difference in equality and participation, very important word there, in society. The Viking woman had a very independent life compared to the Christian woman. When Scandinavia was Christianized, a lot of the women's freedoms was taken away, and they were no longer as important in their society, in their social standing, and in their religion as they had been. The Christian religion put the man above the woman, and seen through the modern person's perspective, it was a setback for women. But in spite of this, it was often the Viking women who were positive to the new religion. Now, we can conclude from that this is because the Christian religion demanded a more peaceful lifestyle. That's one of the theories that's put forward. We don't know if that's true, but again, that's one of the theories that's been put forward. Now, by including the modern woman in this comparison, I think that they have more in common with the Viking woman than with the Christian era woman. As I've talked about already, the christening of the Vikings was a setback for the women of this time, and this would result in, generations, centuries of general oppression. At this point, as we go along, rather than waiting until the end and having 800 million different questions and everybody's trying to remember whatever, I'll stop right there, having discussed men and women, and if anyone has a question at that point, type your little exclamation point, and I'll try to address the questions, and if not, or when we finish with those questions, we'll move on to the next section, which is life after death. So does any quiet clarity, go ahead. They were killing everybody. Who was killing who? You're going to have to give me a little more, I don't follow. Well, the Vikings had a very rich culture. They traveled extensively. Believe it or not, Vikings were hired in 4 of the Crusades by European kings as armed forces, pilots, and navigators. So the Vikings were not necessarily a pack of killers. We would think of them more as a type of very aggressive colonialists. Vikings would come into an area and they would set up camp. You can go to Ireland to this day and find the physical remains, the geographic structures, remains of thingsteads, of where there were things held as far away as Ireland. The Vikings would go into an area, they would raid an area, they would plunder an area, but eventually they would start to colonize that area. There's a reason that there are so many people of certain hair colors in certain parts of the world. Let me give you an example of that, which you may not have heard of. Has anyone here heard of the expression, a Norse husband or an Irish wife? Has anyone ever heard of those two expressions before? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? 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 All right. Where did these expressions come from? These came from the time period during which Vikings, which again is a role, not a people, Scandinavian peoples, were coming into Ireland on regular raids. What do I mean by regular raids? I mean that these guys sailed by the weather. They sailed by the time of year, the weather, and the tides, and you could expect a raid on your Irish coastal village around this particular week of this particular month. Okay, they had already been here fucking, 9 times before. On the 10th time we knew they were coming. Probably honestly knew they were coming the 6th time. What would happen in many of these places is, knowing that these big, brawny, bearded, Odin-worshipping, axe-wielding sons of bitches were coming, the men would gather up as much of the crop, the grain, and the cattle, the herds, as they could, as well as what little wealth they had, because you must remember that agrarian agricultural people were not swimming in coins. They had very damn little use for coins, but they had a bigger use for items that were hard to make or hard to keep or that had been passed down in the family. And the men would gather all this the fuck up and would flee to the hills. All right, they would get the fuck away from the village and away from where the raiders were coming from, leaving the women behind. Leaving the women behind, although they would often take the children with them. The Vikings come in, they look around and they say, all right, what's there's left for us? These people would be smart enough to always leave a little bit. All right, you don't want to, if the raiders are coming, you don't want to take everything, because if you take everything, they'll come the fuck after you. All right, but if you leave a little bit, then okay, that's what they'll take. So they take the stores, and then they take to drinking and to fucking. All right. So many of these women regarded themselves as having, for lack of a better term, 2 husbands. You have your Irish husband and you have your Viking husband. Your Viking husband just only comes around on spring in this 1 week. They bore children by these men. The other men would raise these children, all right, because in old culture there's the expression that anybody could be your father, but we all know who your mother is. And that's where you got Irish wife, all right, from. Part of the reason that the men would go away quickly, outside of the danger level and the need to preserve goods and protect children, is something that generally people don't talk about. I'm going to talk about it, and I hope that you're all grown up enough to deal with. Sometimes there's a question, and the question is this: did the Viking Scandinavian cultures engage in homosexuality? The answer is yes and no. By that, you must understand that we have written text and oral history that tells us that these men engaged in a shaming act. they would shame other men by engaging in anal sex with them. All right? How big and bad am I? I'm so big and bad that basically I've made you a woman, would be the attitude if you follow. Does everybody understand how that attitude works? Everybody with me? So a lot of these guys would go, hey, screw that, man. I'm out of here. I'm taking the goods and the kids. I'm going up to the hills. You know, they want to fuck a woman, I'll leave the women behind. And is it a submissive position? Well, yes, it certainly was. It was a shameful position. I have literally fucked you in the ass and made you a woman. All right? Do we have any other questions? Any other questions on this particular area? All right. Moving right along. Now we're going to come to a little section. Again, hopefully we can get through all these sections. I don't know if we will or not. Life after death. The Vikings had a very distinct picture of what happens after death. The ones who were killed in battle went to Valhalla. The others ended up in hell. That's H-E-L. The Vikings believed that Valhalla was a huge banquet hall situated in Asgard, the residence of the gods. And according to myths, it had 540 doors, each so wide that 800 warriors could pass through it side by side. The roof was made of shields, and the rafters were made of spears. Life in Valhalla is described as the ultimate life for a Viking, with everything you could possibly need to be happy. The days were filled with battles and fights to prepare, of course, for the final battle of Ragnarok. And in the evening, the injured and killed ones rose again to join their friends and feast together with the gods themselves. The Valkyrie, the maidens of Odin, served them the meat of the boar, Sarimr, which was a very special boar that could be slaughtered every night, and the mead that came instead of milk came from the goat Hedrum. Hell, on the other hand, was situated down deep, and no matter if you were in Asgard, Midgard, where the humans lived, or the Jondheim, the home of the giants, the way to hell was always down. The entrance to hell was called Gnaphallen, and a horrible growling hound guarded it. There's not much said about what hell looked like exactly and how life was there, but all of the sources refer to it basically as pretty much a dark and terrible place. Now there is a very interesting detail that you can find in some books of mythology, and that is the ship Nagefl. Now, excuse me, I screw it, it's been a long day. Nagefar, when you arrived in hell, if your nails were not properly cut, someone cuts them. And all of these nails went together to build Nagefar. And it's said that when Ragnarok comes, Loki and the other fighters from hell will sail in this ship. All right? So you got to think about that. Basically, that means you got to cut your nails or you're going to end up helping the evil side in Ragnarok. All right? So this image of, well, clearly these were, brutish, unclean, ungroomed sons of bitches, is not true at all. These men were very clean. These men groomed themselves, and very important to that grooming, particularly before going out on raids and other matters where they might risk their lives, was that they cut their nails. All right? Can you fucking believe that? How good is that? All right? All these big, badass, mean fucking Vikings who the world is afraid of are getting goddamn manicures before they go the fuck out to go fight and rage war, because they don't want to end up in hell, all right, riding on that ship. In the myths, generally it seems that people who came to hell were very often murderers, adulterers, etc. but we don't know where the rest of the people went. Now, there's got to have been tons of people that did not die in battle, but weren't fucking murderers and rapists either, okay? All the women, for example. And from what we gather, these people did not go to hell, but we don't know where they went. So, good luck on that. There is a suggestion that there was a place called Gimle where the righteous men went. But you're not going to find any good, reliable sources on that. But you'll probably hear it argued about. Now, it's obvious, and you're all already talking about it, that there are many similarities between the Vikings' view of life and death and the Christian view. The most striking one is perhaps the division of heaven and hell and Valhalla and hell. And many religions believe in some kind of division. I think that's pretty much natural for us to believe in. There's a division between good and evil, a dichotomy between light and dark, cold and warm. And we all kind of want a good place that's a reward for good people, and we all want to think about the bad people, go to the bad place. But there can be seen larger similarities between the Norse mythology and Christianity than, for example, between Norse and, say, Hinduism. Now, this is probably because Christianity has its origin close to the countries where people earlier believed in Greek mythology, which is actually quite similar to the Norse. In Norse mythology, Valhalla is described in detail. The details may vary a little depending on which source you read, but some of them are the same or almost the same. As, for example, the fact that you had an enormous big doors. And it's also commonly known that when you get there, this is what you do, this is what you eat. Heaven, in the Christian mythology, on their hand, is a lot more abstract. It's up to the individual and the individual group and philosophy and sect to make up its own interpretation and picture of what it looks like. It's difficult to say where the influence has come. The Viking Age cultures were almost completely Christianized. So there are a number of scholars who have suggested that what we're reading is, for the most part, still a Christianized version of the way it was before. Does anyone have any questions on this before I move on? And again, if you have a question, just type an exclamation point. All right. So we just don't know. We just don't know, and we're left with a lot of tantalizing ideas, and there's a lot of different interpretations that go on. But what we do know is that in general, these people were religious people. They had a religious component to their culture, that they had a belief that although they did have what we would consider literacy and writing, that they had an incredibly rich oral tradition. And let me discuss something to you right now about that oral tradition. Another fun fact that you may not know. They, and we know this from their writings in their original language, had a great love of alliteration. Everybody know what alliteration is? Apparently, Viking Age people thought alliteration was the bee's knees. They thought that was the fucking coolest thing you could ever do. Linda lazily licks lollipops was fucking, you got a goddamn applause for that. And not just in the sense of making it difficult to say, but as an example in some of the older stories and poems that we have passed down where every line of the poem begins with the same letter sound. All right? So, lo, he went and he did so-and-so, so-and-so. Long did he venture, blah. Last he came to the... That still was, for them, was high fucking art. All right? That you could structure things, tales and things, in that way. Let Lily lick Lionel's lusty leathers. And there it is in the accent for you, because I know you wanted to hear that. Now, I just mentioned that there were certain similarities between Norse mythology and Greek mythology. And I'm going to get into that a little bit here. If we were to compare two different mythologies, it's important that we know exactly what we mean when we write about mythology. As we understand it, the word myth was derived from the Greek word mythos, all right? And myth is generally thought of as a story of forgotten or vague origin, which is supernatural or religious. A story made up to explain or rationalize one or more aspects of the world. Why does it rain? Why does it thunder? Why does this day is the longest day of the year, that day is the shortest day of the year in terms of sunlight? But it's also important to remember that these myths are examples, all right? They're clearly separated from the everyday speech and the word of the people. Myth is a big goddamn topic. So when I get into this, please do not think that I am oversimplifying, because I am. I am oversimplifying. I am oversimplifying just so we can discuss this. But don't take that oversimplification as, oh, it must be that simple and that whatever. Oh, it's so easy. No. But we have to break things down to be able to talk about things within an hour. So let's start with the Norns. The Norns exist in Norse mythology as the three creatures that determine fate. Before they came to Asgard, time did not exist. There was no time before the Norns. Because of this, we could say that the Norns are above the gods, in such meanings that the gods cannot stop the Norns from doing their job, which is to create time. Without time, one cannot determine fate, because then you don't know when the events are going to take place or in which goddamn order. All right? The Norns visit each being, and I mean being, human, god, etc., immediately after they are born to determine his or her future. Now, even though some stories say that there are many Norns, there are usually three only that are mentioned. Urd, which is the past, Skuld, which is the present, and Verdandi, which is the future. Now, these creatures live by the first roots of the Yggdrasil, the world tree, next to a well, which is known as the Well of Fate. Each morning they come out of the cave that they spend their night in, they scoop up water and mix it with the sand around the tree to create a magic dough. They spread it on Yggdrasil to prevent it from becoming rotten and to preserve the life of the tree. Sorry, I'm getting some IMs here. Now let's compare that to the Fates. The Fates of Greek mythology were also known as the Moria, okay, which, by the way, for those of you who are fans of Tolkien, you will be interested to know that as in the Mines of Moria, that Moria means fate. These three females decide how long each individual is going to live. And they were sometimes considered, again, superior to the gods. They were called Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Clotho comes to the newborn and spins out the thread of life. Lachesis measures it and decides what is going to happen to this being, and Atropos cuts it. Now, I will not bore you with Greek inscriptions about that. We will just move on to the fact they're often imagined sitting around a cauldron. So there we have another. So what's the comparison here? In both sets of mythologies, the creatures that determine fate are identical in purpose, gender, and number. They are both above the gods, and their jobs are inevitable for everyone. No one can go against the fates. Now, there are, of course, several Greek stories which tell about the tragedy of a person who tries to overcome their fate. In Norse mythology, Odin himself learns about his fate of being killed during Ragnarok, and by the Fenris wolf, from the Norns. And there's nothing he can do about it but prepare himself and his allies. Both the Norns and the Fates were thought of as sitting around something circular. This may be representative of the circle of life, which is not exclusive to these myths. And if we consider the mythologies as a reflection of the society, the conclusion we arrive at is that both the Greeks and the Vikings believed that their lives were already decided, and one can only follow his or her fate. This may have made it easier for people to live, particularly in harsh climates. Basically, what was written was inevitable, and all were equal in this. Does anyone have any questions on that? And if so, once again, there's that fabulous woo exclamation point. Anyone at all? See, now, yes, that's a very good point. See, now, what I have to do at this point is interject a little humor into this. And first of all, here's what I have to say. Ha ha! Ha 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 ha! Suckers! Suckers! You came here tonight because you went, oh, Ulric's teaching. That's going to be fun. You didn't know that Ulric was a goddamn pedantic, did you? You didn't know. You had no fucking clue that I've taught before in real life and that I fucking will go on about shit forever with all these big, boring words. You thought I was going to be flying from the rafters screaming and yelling, didn't you? Suckers! Suckers, suckers, suckers. It was foreordained. It had been, yes, it is foreordained, the Norns. The Norns. Now, let's go even further. And further emphasize that the Greek and Norse mythologies are connected to each other. Because let's look at some words which have traveled through those languages in the times. Erd, which means fate, is related to the Old English word weird. Let me spell that for you. Weird. Some of you who've role-played with Ulric and with Wynn will have seen that word used. And you may have thought, what goddamn hocus-pocus, bullshit, onlineism, non-Gorean crapola is this? It is simply that it is related to the word urd. Now, weird, interestingly enough, originally meant fate too. And we have that word left as in the weird sisters, which, by the way, are the fates. All right? It has come to mean strange, but it actually meant fate. Where is an example of these three weird sisters, these three fate sisters of destiny, in a more modern source than this ancient Viking culture or ancient Greek culture? How many people here have seen Macbeth? Come on, don't be a bunch of silent Nellies. Fucking say something. Me, good, there you go. Macbeth, 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 exactly. Now, Macbeth. Do we all remember seeing the three weird sisters? Do we all remember seeing the fates? They're represented as the witches. That's right. So this is a powerful image that continues. I will clue you in to something that goes on in the Tormark Fell. Because like I said, this is not just going to be a completely dry class. I'm going to talk a little bit about home and gore and a few other things. So for all you in the Tormark Fell, I would point out to you that in the middle of Ironhall, off to one side, there's this giant tree. Is it the Yggdrasil tree? No, but follow me. Come along. There's a giant tree. At the base of that tree, there is a cave. In that cave lives a rune priestess, and often others that are learning to be rune priests and priestesses are trained in that cave. Outside that cave is a cauldron. It might be a pot, it might be a well. It's hard to determine which. That woman who lives in that cave is considered the grandmother of Ironhall. Does anybody know her sister? Anybody know her sister? Come on, work with me. Now, Wynn is the chick I'm talking about. Wynn is who I'm talking about. Her Allie, that's right, Snow. Allie, and what is Allie called? Allie is called the Modir, the mother of Ironhall. So this is riddle me this, Tormark Fellians. Where's the third sister? Where's the third sister? There's something you can role play with. Where's the third sister? Bane. Bane's the third sister. Yes. Where's the third sister? All right. Does anyone have any questions? What a twist. Does anyone have any questions on anything we've discussed so far? Anything at all? Any questions? Because otherwise I'm going to move right the hell on. All right, I'm moving the hell along. We're going to talk a little bit now about the world of the Viking era. Unlike many other people in Europe, between 700 BC and 1100 AD, and yes, I still use BC and AD, sue me, the Vikings, interestingly enough, did not think that the world was flat. Now, that's a very important statement. They did not believe that the world was flat. Yes, they did. They have stopped using that, Torolf. Yeah, I know. In Norse mythology, the people believed that the universe was divided into 9 different realms, all connected to each other through the world tree, which, of course, as we've talked about, is called Yggdrasil. Echo, they would be academia. When we say they have stopped using BC and AD, the they would be academia. No, they haven't? Oh, well, excuse me. I must have had my head put up my ass and not known what the fuck was going on anymore in commonly written texts that discuss history. My apology. Moving right along. The worship of trees, because of the Yggdrasil tree, and the belief that some trees were sacred, was common among many different Germanic people during this time. You will see that as an example in the Tormark Fell of that tree I had just discussed. The Viking tradition of sacrificing 9 animals of male gender in an oak tree every 9th year is a typical example of this. And now during this time, the most dignified sacrifice was not a man, it was a horse. And this was because of this, this will relate back to a topic that happened in the pre-show. Because of this, the Catholic Church forbade all Christians from eating horse meat. All right? Earlier, before the class started, someone here mentioned that apparently recently the prohibitional law in the United States against eating horse meat had been removed. So, there you go, by the way. There's where it comes from. Now, here's a question for you all. So 9 animals were sacrificed. The most important of these sacrifices was a horse. Can anyone tell me how these animals were sacrificed? Can anyone tell me what the traditional mode of sacrifice was? Anyone who's not Branwen? Can anyone who's not Branwen tell me what the method of? Yes, Rain, you can guess. Go ahead, Rain. Guess. Rain is now going to guess. Dun 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 dun. Bum ba-dum bum 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 bum. Very good, Rain. They were hung. Sacrifices were hung. Now imagine how fucking hard it was to hang a horse. I'm not talking about we wrap a rope around the horse and we pull it up in a tree and we just leave it there till it dies because it ain't got no food. No, I mean hanging like in to hang a man, hang man. Okay, yes, so not commenting on hung like a horse. I mean hung as with a rope around the neck. There's strangulation. And this, thank you, Wynn, this is the same method of sacrifice in Marauders done with Bosk. That is correct. So here we see another category, another similarity. Now, the Yggdrasil had 3 roots, and at each root there was a water source. The first root reached all the way down to Nephilim, which was the realm of the dead. All right, and there you could find the source of all the rivers in the world. And it was also told that the dreadful dragon Nindahog was lying near, eating at the roots eternally of the Yggdrasil tree. The frost giants dwelt in Jotunheim, where the second root ended. And here was the water source for the spring of knowledge, wisdom, prophecy, and poetry. Mimir was the guardian of that, according to legends, and he drank from the well every day his horn. And because of this, he was considered to be the personification of wisdom. But he also played the role as a link to the past. Now, here again we see some possibilities of influence or connection to the Christian story. A tree is of wisdom. That taking from this tree makes human wiser or more knowledgeable. We also see that in modern-day Germanic fairy tales, where the spring of wisdom or health can be found, Ponce de Leon even. Now, beneath the third root was the holy well. All right? Oderbrunn. The water in this well was so sacred that anything it touched turned as white as the inside of an eggshell. And this was the place where the gods held their council, their ting. In order to get here, they had to ride over the Bifrost Bridge that linked earth and heaven. Of course, as we discussed before, the 3 Norns lived nearby. They lived near that well. The Norns ruled over destiny of mortals and gods, as we've talked about. Their job for making that holy dough that we spoke about earlier was to repair some of the damage of the places where the dreadful dragon Nidhogg had been eating away at the tree. Now, an interesting detail here with the Norns is that they play such an important role in Norse mythology. They rule over everyone's life, including the gods. But it is also their duty to look after the world. Okay? The gods often play this role, and not 3 old women knowing their will. All right? The Norns were the bridge from the past to the future, not only of individuals, but of the world itself. All right? They kept it all going. Now, humans lived in Midgard, which was surrounded by all the oceans, and exploration was something they were very damn good at. How far did they explore? Well, they visited the Americas, Asia, Europe, Russia, Iceland, Greenland. They traveled to Africa. They traveled to the Middle East. Good night, Yasmina. We have evidence of them as far away as Turkey. Eventually, how does this all end? Eventually, there is a trembling of the Yggdrasil tree, which would signal the end of the world, the beginning of Ragnarok. The gods and the giants would have their final battle, and nothing would survive. However, the Yggdrasil would remain standing, and from the tree 2 humans would emerge and repopulate the world. So, stories like these, they're important. Not only because of their religious purpose, but also because of their function as entertainment during the cold and long goddamn winter nights. These stories were not primarily written down and someone had to memorize them. The stories about the Yggdrasil, the number 3, were used very frequently. 3 roots, 3 water sources, 3 Norns. And it may have been part of a way that made it easier to remember this in an oral tradition. Does anyone have any questions on that? Anyone at all? Any questions like that? All right. I'm going to take that as a no, and now I'm going to move on to the final part of this class, and this is probably the reason you all came. Because you knew Ulric was going to get into it. So here we go. That was a very dry, scholarly sort of thing. Not quite as in-depth as I would have normally taught a class in the old days, because it has to be compressed into an hour. It's just meant to give a flavor and a taste. What can we take of it? What does it mean? Thanks for the information, Ulric, but big fucking deal. What the fuck can I do with that? Well, you can do a lot with that. And I'm going to tell you some of it, and I'm going to lay down some comparisons between what we've just heard and hopefully learned and gore. Ready? Okay. We know from Marauders, we have as book quotes, that there is, for lack of a better term, an ongoing Christianization into Tovaldsland. If you want to call it a priest-kinganization, be my guest. That's too much goddamn work for my tongue and mouth to do. We know that the initiates are trying to make headway, according to the fiction, at the time of Father Forkbeard, make inroads into Tovaldsland. And we know that they are doing that aggressively, meaning they're not just coming around going, hi, we want to open a hospital, and, we're here to represent the priest kings. Have you been saved by are the priest kings your personal Lord and Savior? Would you like to read our pamphlet? Every Torby's woken up on Saturday morning early because the fucking initiates are on his door smiling. No. That's not how they're going about it. How they're going about it is they have made it illegal, a profane act, to make the sign of the hammer over one's drink. All right? We know that they have boiled men in oil for doing this profaned act. We know that they have roasted men slowly over a fire for this act. We know that they have pressured economically and through martial power the Jarls of the North to try to begin to convert to the worship of the priest kings. We also know it's not taken. We know it's not taken, and we see exactly what Forkbeard thinks of that, don't we? He uses it as a fucking excuse to get his supposedly dead body into the high temple of Cassel, And at the last moment, after the high initiate says, "Praise be the priest kings," he throws off his shroud and leaps up and goes, "Praise Odin!" And then kills the high initiate, cuts his head right off his fucking shoulders, and they loot the living shit out of the temple, steal everybody's pocketbook, rings, car keys, and take their daughters. They jack that fucking temple mad. I mean, mad jack that fucking temple. It is gone. Nothing left. Not even rims. They fucking strip that bitch. All right? How much do they take? They take so much that Forkbeard has a helm full of fucking gold, so that when they get started, when they start to the goddamn docks and get stopped by all the men on the docks, all right, that are going to try to save the women, Forkbeard throws coins at them and they go, "Ah, yeah, fuck those bitches. I got some coins here." No, it's cool. It's cool. So, first of all, let me address what Crick just said. No holy war in the Tormark Fell. Fucking men. I don't want to roleplay with holy war. It's boring. It's just fucking boring, and nobody ever wins, and it just goes on, and it's a pain in the ass, and it makes me miserable, and I'll tell you all to go kiss my ass and stop playing. But what we learn about our fiction, and what we learn about the roles in the world that we're playing in, doesn't necessarily have to be played out. It adds a richness to our knowledge. It adds a richness, meaning, well, we all know that Torvies apparently don't get along with initiates. All right, why? Now you know, okay? Now you can say. Now you can add that into your personal pride of being a Torvie, all right? It is pride in worshiping Odin. Praise Odin, all right? Now you have that, and what do we see? We see yet another historical mark to the book. We know that John Norman was no slouch. He borrowed from a lot of different stories. The story of Forkbeard in the High Temple of Cassau is a real story from real life. That actually happened. All right? There was a very famous Jarl who pulled that trick in the Mediterranean. He had converted to Christianity, supposedly. His last wish was that his dead body be brought into the city that the Vikings couldn't fucking take. They couldn't storm the city. Oh, he's dead, and he just wants to have, he converted to the one true faith, and he wants to be his body to be taken into your temple. So they open the doors, and they let the procession in with their dead Jarl, and they get about halfway in, and he jumps off his fucking bier, and they attack everybody, You know what I'm saying here? Trojan horse style. So we have historic examples. Let me give you another example that you can take with you. We earlier talked about the place of women and the power of women, and how women had great sway and power of their own selves in Scandinavian and Viking era culture before the Christianization. We have that as well right here in Gore. Our women have say. They are strong, intelligent women who protect our children and our homes while we're off plundering and raiding and fighting cur. No offense to the cur in the room. All right? And we like our women that way. And the Southerners, our old Southern pals, right? What do they want? They would love our women to be cowed and to shut the fuck up and to be seen and not heard. So we have that element as well. If you want to think about the influence of the South into Tovaldsland, look to your historic fact and look at the influence of Middle European Christian culture into pagan Scandinavian Viking era culture, and you're not going to be far off the goddamn mark. So, with 6 minutes left here, and no questions apparently, I will say this in conclusion. It is often said that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. I disagree. I believe that those who do not know their history cannot even form up the plan for tomorrow. History, no matter which history it is, because history is, at the end of the day, a consensus of lies and the writings of winners. But any history gives you a yardstick and a measuring point by which you may judge your present self, your present circumstances, and potentially your future. We are all here to have fun. We're not here to take a college-level class. None of us are working on our degrees in Gorean fiction. Thank God. But, that being said, I encourage you, if you wish to have a greater depth, not only to your role play, but to your enjoyment of your time here, first and foremost, read Marauders. Listen to Marauders. Take that information in. And then read your history of your Viking era peoples. Even if you don't get to use but a tenth of it, it will encourage you, it will give you greater enjoyment, it will make more fun for you and more fun for the people around you, because at the end of the day, the most boring part of role play is when nobody knows what the fuck to say, and we all end around looking at each other going, another mead? So, thank you for coming. If you do have any final questions at this point, I will answer them. If there are any questions whatsoever, just type your exclamation point. Otherwise, you know. If anybody's chewing gum, did you bring enough for the rest of the class? No, I don't have a, it was an example, Crick. That was an example. Raven has a question for Wynn.
Yes.
Go right ahead, Raven.
The circle, I'm going to out us. Not in totality, don't freak, Ulric.
I have no idea what she's talking about, and I've never met this woman.
Right. I have a habit of placing things on the sim that feel good to me. I do not define them fictionally. I place them because it creates interesting thought and role play. It's definitely not a bond circle. That I can tell you. What?
As I said, there's no actual purpose behind it besides it just looking nice.
No. That is a simplification of the method in which I build fictional communities. I have a vast education in medieval and pagan culture. Every community that I have built, along with Ulric and Alyssa and Bane, has always engaged in vast symbolic representation that can be found out of ancient and pagan and medieval cultures. So when I make a choice, it is not because I as a modern woman goes, oh, it's gold and pretty and it looks right. No, something about that graphic rang true to the world in which we are engaged in. And so I place that graphic with the intention of enlightening and illuminating your imagination. Where you take it will be the collective decisions of our community.
But it's not a bond circle.
It's not a bond circle.
Right.
Yes, Tart.
Tart. Is this for Win, me, or just the any old fool? Oh, okay, Win, this is for you.
Could be an enlarged version of the oath ring.
Could be a nice ring for boys to have wrestling matches in.
Could be a wrestling ring. When am I going to do another rune reading? I assume you want another batch of rune readings. I'm going to answer that very selfishly. When I get paid for it. It is more exhausting than running these sims and teaching. But if a lot of you want me to do rune readings, I will do rune readings. But I want tier donations for them. Then
Any
pick
other
a time,
questions?
Snow, and put it on the list, and I will come and do rune readings.